continues.
Right. And then we heard, I mean, I guess the leaks are continuing because I think last night or very recently CNN reported that there were going to be additional arrests before the end of the week. I'm not asking you to comment on that. I'm just saying that I think from all of our points of view we have to be concerned about those kinds of activities, and I hope you will pursue them with as much alacrity as you can.
Well, sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between leaks and speculation and rumor mill material that comes and flows through every process, and it's very difficult to deal with.
Okay, let me ask you another about another group, the Hamas group, which is a well-known terrorist group. Not commenting on this specific case again, but as you know, I asked to be briefed over a month before this happened about Hamas in the United States by agents in your office, and they told me that there wasn't too much to worry about, that they weren't doing much in the United States. Do the events of the last 3 or 4 weeks indicate to you that we ought to be taking a second look or a deeper look or a more thorough look at Hamas and Hamas in the United States? I note the Israelis just arrested an American citizen, it so happens, and obviously their justice system is not ours, and we don't vouch for its credibility here. Well, you can't. But that was transporting illegal, I think it was funds, between the United States and the West Bank. So my general question is...
Mr. Chairman, I have some problem, if you don't mind, with I think perhaps this ought to be done in a closed session. We're talking about intelligence matters here.
Well, I would ask the director if there's anything sensitive that he can. I'm just asking about the general organization. If he feels it's inappropriate to answer, he will, as he's done before in this hearing, and we assured him that at the beginning. Go ahead, Director.
Mr. Chairman, you have referred to matters that were the subject matter of briefing. I think it is inappropriate for me to comment on any matters that relate to our investigations or our responsibility under counterintelligence and counterterrorism. And I think the suggestion of Chairman Edwards is appropriate, that if there's that kind of discussion, it might be in closed session.
I don't think we'll go into closed session and ask everybody to leave on this if it's okay with the Chairman, but we'll follow it up at a later time in a later place in a closed briefing, if that's okay.
Again, I would not want to be a participant in fueling speculation, and I think it's inappropriate for me to do that.
Let me move on to I have a couple more questions here, and then I will be finished. Let's see. Nope. No. Nope. Okay. If I have others, I'll submit them in writing. I think I've gotten through most of them. I want to conclude unless anybody else. Mr. Mazzoli, go ahead.
One quick question, maybe of Ambassador McNamara or whoever would care to. There has been some thought here that perhaps the asylum laws of the nation allow people to stay in the country for prolonged periods of time while their asylum petitions are being played out. And the current law allows individuals even 2 different claims of asylum, each of which could be played out in the court process. Do you see in your work now any advantage with respect to terrorism, which is your field, any advantage were the laws to be changed to give individuals fewer bites of that apple, or to somehow streamline the proceeding so that it could move more swiftly and reach a determination of yes or no on asylum?
From the perspective of counterterrorism, Congressman, yes, the laws could use change, tightening up, in order to ensure that legitimate asylum is treated and that cases are adjudicated much more rapidly than they are. It seems to me, again, from the point of view of counterterrorism, that the system is overloaded. It takes months and years before even simple cases get through and individuals are asked to leave or it's decided they can stay. Therefore, the individual doesn't know. He's left in uncertainty as to whether he's going to stay. And those who are up to no good and are in fact illegally here with intentions of staying illegally go about their business while they await adjudication. It's unfortunate, I think, that in the current circumstances, the vast majority of illegal immigrants, once they set foot on U.S. soil, however fraudulently or deviously they arrived here, they need not fear expulsion. The system simply does not get to them. And without adjudication or with very late adjudication, they wind up staying here. It seems to me, from the point of view of counterterrorism, that the laws and regulation in effect now are unable to secure our borders from illegal immigrants.
Thank you for that direct answer, Mr. Sessions.
Okay, the hearing will resume, and I'd like to call forth our final panel of witnesses. And first, I know that they've been in the audience, and I want to thank them for their patience. Obviously, when you have a topic of such interest as this, the hearing takes a little longer than we had thought. Well, let me welcome our three witnesses. They're distinguished experts on the issue of national security and terrorism. Brian Jenkins is widely recognized as a leading authority on issues relating to international terrorism. From 1986 to 89, he served as chair of the RAND Corporation's Political Science Department, directed RAND's research on terrorism and other forms of political violence. Mr. Jenkins is presently a senior managing director of Kroll Associates, an international investigative and security consulting firm to major corporations and government agencies. Dr. Robert Kupperman is a senior advisor for science and technology at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he's worked on issues ranging from international competitiveness to arms control. A leading expert in the field of counterterrorism, he has advised both U.S. and foreign governments on this issue. Most recently, he served as head of the Clinton transition team for FEMA. Our third witness is Neil Livingstone, one of the foremost authorities on terrorism, security, and crisis management issues. He's currently president of the Institute on Terrorism and Subnational Conflict, and serves as the adjunct faculties of the Foreign Service and the Emergency Management Institutes. He also serves as a consultant to a range of international clients on security and crisis management issues. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here on short notice, and I understand that at least some may not have a written statement for the record because of time constraints, and therefore, without objection, the record will be left open for a week to receive prepared statements. Gentlemen, each of you should take a few minutes to summarize your views on this issue before we begin questioning. We'll begin with Mr. Jenkins, then go to Mr. Kupperman, and then Mr. Livingstone. Mr. Jenkins. Thank you.
Very much, Mr. Chairman. Whether the World Trade Center bombing presages a new wave of terrorism, we cannot say. We can say that American citizens and facilities abroad have always been the #1 target in international terrorist incidents. It is the price we pay for the often exaggerated perceptions of U.S. influence and for the fact that Americans can be found almost everywhere in the world. In this regard, we bear the burden of world leadership. The United States will be blamed for many of the world's problems, blamed that these problems remain unsolved, blamed for trying to solve them, and if the solutions do not satisfy all of the participants, we'll be blamed for that. Americans will continue to be terrorist targets. What is the likelihood of further terrorist incidents on U.S. soil? Authorities and analysts have always conceded the possibility that a spectacular terrorist event could occur in the United States. The bombing of the World Trade Center merely demonstrates that vulnerability. Although terrorists who operated in other parts of the world could always carry out attacks here, generally they did not, in part because of operational difficulties, but also in part because of self-imposed constraints, constraints resulting from political calculations and even ambivalent attitudes toward the American people and America as a place, as opposed to the policies of the United States government. With this bombing, even if the result of local initiative, a taboo has been broken, and that is not without psychological significance. Others may be inspired to follow the example. We have already seen one threat of terrorism related to America's role in the Balkans. Others are likely. What can we do about it? I find it difficult to identify the specific piece of legislation that could have prevented this tragedy. Still, there are some things we can do, as well as some things we probably should not do. Terrorists seek to create, through dramatic incidents of violence, an atmosphere of fear and alarm. We can thwart their efforts by how we choose to portray these events. In that regard, these hearings can help by putting terrorism into its proper perspective and outlining a reasonable course of action. We should avoid overreaction, hysteria, and paranoia. We should guard against the tendency to blame ourselves or to look for scapegoats. And we should not be distracted from our fundamental domestic or foreign policy goals or be tempted to divert vast amounts of precious resources into unrealistic security schemes. Our approach should be prudent, pragmatic, and penurious. There is little protection against bombings in public places. Although security is tight in the United Kingdom, a country that has suffered 2 decades of terrorist campaigns, and police in that country are mobilized to deal with the problem, and the public is constantly reminded of the need to be vigilant, bombs still go off in London. So we ought not to have unrealistic expectations about what we can do to prevent bombings in public places. At the same time, the greatest threat to the physical security of Americans comes not from the remote threat of terrorism, but the everyday reality of ordinary crime. Without diminishing the casualties of the World Trade Center in the week that followed that bombing, something like 400 people were murdered in this country. We can spend billions on security against bombers. Those billions might save more lives if spent elsewhere. We should look carefully at how those responsible for the World Trade Center bombing amass such a large quantity of explosives. We cannot stop people from buying fertilizer or other ingredients that can be made into homemade explosive concoctions. But the purchase of explosives is easy in this country, and in addition to purchase, tens of thousands of pounds of commercial and military explosives are stolen every year. We should review security measures. The World Trade Center bombing will regrettably provoke anti-Arab sentiments in this country, as well as more general anti-immigration sentiments. The bombing should not be used as an argument for prejudice or against immigration. It is true that along with the wretched and the poor, we have occasionally welcomed also those who refuse to leave the violent quarrels of their homeland behind them. It is not easy to tell in advance whether a refugee or an immigrant will turn out to be a terrorist or a tycoon. We can, however, explore ways to expel from our society those who insist on promoting, preaching, or practicing violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Dr. Kupperman.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'd like to first correct the record. I was head of the transition team for FEMA in the Reagan administration.
Oh, it's a world of difference. It will be corrected.
We tend, I think, to deal with complex security problems episodically, waiting for crisis conditions to force our hands. I think terrorism is a case in point. It's an issue laden with subtle and sometimes not so subtle traps. More than the political embarrassment from incidents in which the tail wags the dog, terrorism can turn truly ugly overnight, and the shock of another Pan Am 103 disaster can pale in comparison with nuclear, chemical, or biological acts of mass destruction. Such assaults, once the province of only industrialized nations, are now achievable by such subnational groups. Our most recent experience, the bombing of the World Trade Center, where the equivalent of a small city could have been wiped out, and where the actual impact on business could easily be in the range of $1 billion, shows how vulnerable we are. Imagine for the moment that the magnitude of the catastrophe, if instead of a relatively crude conventional explosive, the instrument, the weapon might have been a radiological device dispersing cobalt-60. The attack on the World Trade Center highlights one important fact of life. We can't protect everything all the time. We need to be able to identify truly critical nodes and protect them
or at least make them more prickly targets for the would-be attack.